Hello, and welcome to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Let's unpack the relationships that we encounter in our daily lives and learn about what makes them tick. And now your host for Red Rock Relationships, Dr. James B. Stein.
Welcome back to another episode of Triple R, and I am your host, same as always. And we are steamrolling to the end of the second season. There are some very exciting things that we have planned for the off season, specifically for the summer. There's a couple of things that we're working on here, so do stay tuned for those announcements. I know that y'all just need to get that many more doses of the show. But in the meantime, we're not done yet. We have 3 more episodes this season, and I am absolutely gassed up today to be talking about expectancies and the violations of those expectancies with my guest, soon-to-be Dr. Emi Hashi. I'm so happy to have you here, Emi. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and Emi comes at the recommendation of Laura is your chair, right?
Yeah, she's my advisor.
So Emi comes at the recommendation of a former guest on this show, Dr. Laura Guerrero, who helped us talk about jealousy back in season 1. And I often turn to her when I say, hey, who should I get to talk about this? And so, Emi, yours was the first name to come out of the proverbial hat, as it were.
I'm honored.
So we do need to spend some time talking today about what even an expectancy is in the context of relationships. I guess we can touch on the theory a little bit, but we probably won't dive too deep. But before we do any of that, like always, we need to hear about our guests and who they are and where they come from and what they're all about. So, Emi, could you take a couple minutes and tell the audience about, how you landed on this topic?
Yeah, so my name is Emi. I'm from Hawaii. I was born and raised there, and discovered communication research just by chance. I fell in love with it, and so I study interpersonal communication. I am particularly interested in friendships, although I'm also interested in other types of relationships as well. One of my more recent interests is trying to look at developmental communication, which doesn't really exist. There's developmental psychology, where we look at like how as kids grow up, their brains change and their relationships change, but the relationships are often tangential to the brain changes. And so I'm really interested in that aspect of it. And so in terms of how I came to this topic, I just kind of fell into it. I'm really interested in nonverbal communication, and expectancy violations is definitely a big part of that. And so relating back to my interest in child development, I had originally planned for my dissertation to study some sort of expectancy violations with really young preschoolers and to see if at that young age they would be able to conform or have these expectations.
Cool. That's so much information all in one researcher. And of course, like so many more of my guests, you are a product of Arizona State University. So we are just repping the absolute crap out of that university, and I'm running out of ASU people, to be perfectly honest. But it's really good to find out, just kind of what makes you tick and why you're so interested in this really important topic. So if you're okay with it, I'd like to just jump right in and talk about some of these expectancy issues. And if it's okay with you, I would like to start with expectancy violations theory. And this is the most textbooky we're going to get all day long, I promise. So, if you could, can you give us a summary of what that theory proposes and maybe why it's so important to study expectancies and how we violate them?
So expectancies are how people react when people behave in ways that they don't expect or that are kind of counterintuitive. And so, one of the assumptions of this theory, and this doesn't go for all communication scholars, but some of us do believe that we want to explain and predict behavior, and so that's one of kind of the core assumptions. And so when we have these expectations for people, we're trying to predict, we're trying to see how we think they're going to behave, and sometimes people don't act that way. And so prior to expectancy violations theory, people thought that it was always a negative thing, that when you behave unexpectedly, it's always negative. But one of the things that expectancy violations and Judy Burgoon, the person who created the theory, brought in was that expectations and violations of expectations aren't always negative. Sometimes they can be positive.
Yeah, and just I think we've talked about Judy Burgoon on this show before, but just to contextualize how powerful of a scholar she is, Judith Burgoon is the woman who advised both doctors Laura Guerrero and Corey Floyd, who were both my and your professors as we were earning our PhDs and doing classwork. So we're talking about one of the fundamental communication scholars, and if I'm not mistaken, she might still be the most published communication scholar of all time. And if she's not, she's top 2.
Yeah, she was also my advisor and Hawaii's advisor. So I'm like a hybrid grandchild, as you are, James.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, so her work on EVT was instrumental, and it was originally developed surrounding nonverbal behaviors, right? So we're talking about the nonverbal, the gestures, the facial expressions, the eye behaviors that people do that aren't expected or that aren't normal and that cause us to go, wait a minute, what was that? And sort of the reactions that we have to those unexpected behaviors are at the core of EVT. So what are some of the things that we do when somebody violates one of our expectancies?
So EVT at its core is relatively simple. I like how you explained it. But then it gets a little bit more complicated. So to my understanding, EVT is broken down into kind of this positive and negative violations, and then there's ambiguous violations in the middle. So if somebody does something that's we can easily categorize, right? Because again, we're just trying to predict and explain behavior. Mm-hmm. If we can easily figure out if it's a positive or negative violation, we're probably going to respond appropriately, right? Mm-hmm. So positive violations will like them more. Positive violation would be something like, somebody gets you a gift that's unexpected or something like that.
A surprise birthday party, maybe something like that.
Surprise birthday party, right? Something that's good. Mm-hmm. Negative violation would be somebody sits too close to you on the bus, right? Or stops you in the face or something like that.
You walk
right?
in on your partner committing infidelity.
But,
not good.
It would hurt or it would be negative.
Right.
Then we have the ones in the middle. So maybe the sitting on the bus might actually be in the middle. It depends if they're sitting way too close to you, right? Then that is probably clearly a negative violation. But what if there's an empty bus and they're sitting like 2 seats away from you? Mm-hmm. That's kind of ambiguous because normally you would want to give as much room as possible, but then, it would depend. And so to answer your question, how do we respond? It depends on the situation. And that's where we look at towards reward value. And so we tend to forgive, for lack of a better word, rewarding individuals. Mm-hmm. We are more okay with them violating our expectations when they are seen as rewarding, as opposed to non-rewarding individuals. We don't like it. We tend to have more uncertainty, negative evaluations, things like that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the bus situation because that's the example I use in my classes to explain reward value. When a stinky person sits next to us and it's too close on the bus, we're like, ooh, I don't like this at all. But like if someone's gorgeous and they sit next to us on an empty bus, we're like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that, right? And we get a little bit more excited about it. Now, okay, so let's then break this down a little bit more and talk about how that how these principles invade our close relationships, because that's really what we're trying to get out here. So in relationships, obviously we have expectations of our partners or even of our, our friends, our best friends, et cetera, et cetera. What are the sorts of relationships, what are the sorts of expectancies that we might have for our partner in a, a committed or a romantic or a sexual relationship? What are the most common expectations that we have, and why are they important in the first place?
Okay, I might have to come back to that second part, but
okay.
In terms of the first part, like what are some common expectations? It really depends on the relationship. EVT talks about how there's 3 characteristics: the communicator, the relationship, and the context. And so that really dictates what our expectations are. So depending on the person, what they look like, their background, the communicator itself, we might have expectations. Depending on our relationship with them, how close we are, we probably have expectations. And then depending on the context of the situation, we have different expectations. things that have been looked at in the context of EET are wide. Computer mediated communication or communicative technologies is a big one. They look at like unfriending people online on Facebook, cell phone usage during dates. Like, if you're on your phone during a date, what are the expectations there? Video games and how you're supposed to appropriately respond in those situations. So there's definitely a wide variety of things that can be looked at.
Interesting.
Your second question, why do they matter? It has to do with impressions. I would think that, people want to be liked. We have this desire to set off a positive impression. And so you might want to keep in mind these expectancy violation norms, general guidelines. They're not really rules, but just general guidelines so that you can try to meet expectations and form positive evaluations.
Okay, so I find it really interesting that you brought up the phone because, like, I'm not going to lie. I am like, where is it? I'm one of the people, I'm addicted to my phone. Like, I can't stop looking away. I'm looking at it now. I have some TikTok notifications, and there's nothing that I would love to do more than open it up and see what those notifications are. But I'm going to be a good boy and not do it because I respect your time. Now,
I'm sure your listeners expect you to not be on your phone as well during a podcast, right?
Yeah, and I think that you might expect me not to do it. And if I were to do it, it would probably be largely insulting to you because I reached out to you. I wanted to have you on here, and now you're going to come on my show, and I'm going to act like I don't even care or I'm paying attention to something else. Now imagine that, but it's with the person that you're in a long-term relationship with, or it's with the person you've chosen to share your life with, and they do it every time you have brunch together. I got yelled at by a former partner for doing that exact thing, and I remember thinking, well, EVT says that she should be expecting me to do this at this point. She should know that I'm going to be doing this. And obviously that was a bit of an obtuse way to look at things, but I think that you're right. I think that it is important because we have these certain expectations of our partner, and we need to be able to rely on them. So that's meaningful. But
yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm not really sure how the research would respond to what you said about, like, over time, I'm sure cell phone usage could actually become part of the relationship, right? That you expect this of your partner. That doesn't mean they have to be happy with it. Mm-hmm. So, that's a different satisfaction is a whole different thing as well. But yeah, over time, that might actually become part of the new expectations for the relationship.
Yeah, and I think it also really depends on the relationship. So yes, these expectations are meaningful and they carry weight and we should be paying attention to them, but they change from relationship to relationship. So if it's okay with you, I would like to bleed in some conversations that I've had with previous guests, specifically ASU people, in talking about things like friends with benefits relationships and some of the more casual relationships that college students typically encounter. How might expectations of, let's say, a long-term, committed, romantically involved relationship differ from the expectations that you would have in something like a friends with benefits relationship, if at all? Do they differ at all, and if so, how?
Yeah, friends with benefits relationships, there's a reason why we love to study them. They're so interesting and they're so full of uncertainty. And so in terms of how they would differ from committed romantic relationships in terms of expectancies, perhaps you don't have as many of those expectations to go off of in a friends with benefits relationship. I think it really depends, though. Like, a lot of these, I always tell this to my interpersonal class, like my catchphrase is, it depends. It really depends.
Yeah, it does.
And, you could have long-term friends with benefits relationships as well, and that they actually have created an expectancy of their relationship. Like, if you have good communication in a friends with benefits relationship, you can actually have very clear expectations. And so hopefully, there won't be violations. But definitely there's a lot of potential for expectancy violations in friends with benefits relationships if you're not clear about that. Because, what do you do if you do end up dating someone else? How do you end that friends with benefits relationship? Are they entitled to like a breakup moment, like a committed relationship, right? There's definitely a lot of uncertainty, which obviously has its own set of theories, but it also ties into expectancies.
I love that turn of phrase you just used, entitled to a breakup moment. That's so interesting. Well, it just places so much importance on things like closure, which unfortunately FWBR relationships are notorious for not having closure, and it's really sad. And so this makes me think of the conversation that I had with Dr. Truscelli, what feels like ages ago now, about the expectancies that we have in these friends with benefits relationships. And it really comes down to like, what I tell my classes are, if you're in a friends with benefits relationship and you have those super clear expectations, and you have really strong communication and a clear boundary of like, this is our time and this is individual time and this is that and this is this. Are you even in a friends with benefits relationship? Are you not just in a relationship that in which there are permissions to perhaps sleep with other people? That's the question. So I guess a polyamorous relationship, perhaps. Yeah. This is the question I'm constantly asking and re-asking my students, and I can never get a solid answer. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's a great point. It depends on how you define relationships. When I define relationships to my 110 introductory classes, I say relationships are a set of expectations, that you have a relationship with someone at the point that you come to expect something from them, even if it's like a ritualistic encounter with your bus driver, like, hey Joe, how are you? I'm good, right? Or further committed relationships that I expect my partner to come home every night and cook dinner and do all these different things. And so friends with benefits relationships are relationships, definitely, right? They are a type of relationship. But I think that's a great point. Like, how does that truly differ then from romantic relationships, monogamous romantic relationships, except for that expectation of monogamy, of having just one partner? I'm not sure that if you really do have these strong friends with benefits relationships where you clearly lay out your expectations, then maybe it's no longer a friends with benefits relationship.
I don't know. But what I do know is that most friends with benefits relationships are not like that. Unfortunately, they are plagued by a distinct lack of communication and by some really, really upsetting expectations. I think about, and I know I keep bringing up former guests, but I think about a paper written by Dr. Van Raalte where they went over the rules that FWBR partners have for each other, and they were like the most depressing rules ever. It was like, if you sleep with someone, I don't want to hear about it. Or like, if you sleep with someone, I have to hear about it. Or if you sleep with someone, we're not going to be together for another 3 days so that you can, I don't know, metaphorically clean yourself. But it was never a rule about like safer sex practices, or like it was never a rule that involved, like there were rules where like, okay, we're not allowed to catch feelings for each other, which is like such an hurtful, restrictive rule of like, I'm entering this relationship and I'm not allowed to feel anything for the person that I'm sharing
to, like,
intimate
deny
experiences
your feelings
with. Yeah. So that's what the rule becomes, right? It's not that we're not allowed to; it's that we must deny and repress the feelings. And I think that creates a very unhealthy set of expectations. And you see, we circled back and we found expectations. That was not just a rant about FWBRs. Okay. There's really only one other big thing that I want to talk about today, and it involves a topic that, you've guessed it, we've talked about it on this show before. Specifically, it relates to dating, and I want to specify online dating, and just as a case study, I want to use Tinder. So, I talk to my students about this frequently. When we present ourselves on Tinder, we are inherently creating a set of expectations, right? Like, our partner expects us to look a certain way and have the interests that we say we have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have 2 questions. First question: if I take all the best pictures of myself, the best pictures that I've ever taken where I'm looking real crispy, and I put those on display, am I setting myself up for failure when I go out on the date and I'm not as fresh and clean as I look in those pictures? Or should we be setting that really, really, really high expectation? What do you think?
EVT would say, well, so first off, I would say it depends, obviously, but EVT would say positive expectancy violations are better than negative expectancy violations. So maybe you're setting yourself up for failure. Maybe it's better to put the worst, the awkward angled photos of yourself, kind of pictures, so that you set them up for a mediocre bar, and then when you show up and you look fabulous, then that's a positive violation. I also think it depends on the context, though. I think that on online dating, we do expect a little bit of self-monitoring, of filtering messages, of putting up only our best versions of ourselves. So, are you doing yourself a disservice then if you're not picking your best photos and everyone else is?
Right.
I don't know. I think maybe aim for somewhere in the middle. Like, don't, go. I think if it's one of those ambiguous, you can aim for ambiguous violations. That, like, if it's a good picture but not like too far out, that it's an expectancy violation. That's probably what I would recommend. But clearly, it would depend on so many different things.
Yeah, so that's kind of the second question that I wanted to ask. If we take all of our, for lack of a better term, our uggo pictures, right, where we're just not looking nice at all, if we include only those pictures, are we also setting ourselves up for failure? Because are we not going to get enough swipes at that point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the thing. Some people, I feel like maybe highly attractive individuals might be able to actually afford that, because then they're getting the people who like really truly are liking them at that level, right? And then they can positively violate that expectation. That could be perhaps a strategy. But it also depends what you're looking for, right? Tinder also has different levels of interest and desired outcomes.
Sure, absolutely. And, I think people are often strategically ambiguous about what they want on Tinder. Some people will have a big message that says, "I'm not here for hookups," and some people will have some messages that say, like, "I'm just here for whatever happens." And I think that as humans, we're programmed to sort of decode those messages and find deeper meanings, even if none exist. So to summarize, go ahead.
One other thing that I was
Sure.
thinking of. On Tinder, I think people also purposefully negatively violate expectations. You see a lot of people that try to be controversial in order to get attention, right? And so they think that maybe that's a way, if they can violate those expectations, they got your attention for a little bit, and then maybe you're a little bit more likely to swipe right.
Very interesting. Like, do you have an example? Because I would be fascinated by that.
This is after swiping, but like a lot of the times, like, I'm only speaking from the female perspective, but like, why do guys send like really crude, corny pickup lines? Do you think that's gonna work? Like, I don't know, but like, maybe it got a chuckle out of, if it works 5% of the time, then maybe that's great. But I don't know. I'm just thinking, like, in their description, they have like kind of like offensive things, or like things that make them seem edgy, and maybe that works for some people.
I'll never understand why guys post pictures on Tinder of them holding a fish. That one confuses me.
Interesting.
Is this
it like
are
a
we
fish
gonna
you caught? Like,
are,
for the
yeah, no, like,
interest,
like holding a fish, like, by the mouth, and they're in front of a body of water, and it's like, oh, okay, so you fish, but you could have just said that you fish. Like, here's a picture of you with like blistered cheeks holding a fish, like looking real rough. And I guess the female in question is meant to be impressed by the size of the fish. I think that there's a lot of compensatory messages that are happening there that I'm not ready to get into on this show just yet. We still have a certain level of standard to maintain. So to summarize, what I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, you want to have some flattering pictures, and then maybe also you want to have a picture or two where you're not looking your best, or like a candid picture where it's not the super great angle. So really cute picture to start, in the middle, and then in the end, another really cute picture. And that would tap into, of course, the primacy and the recency effect, where people are more likely to memorize the first and the last thing that they see and not care so much about what's in the middle. And so when they show up, you're like, yeah, but my pictures in the middle were horrible. You should have known.
Yeah,
is that close?
I think at least the first picture should be like your best picture. That's generally the Tinder culture. And then after that, yeah, maybe just like lower the expectancies a little bit to a more normal standard.
Yeah, you wanna have that hook, right? You wanna grab the attention and then say, huh? Maybe me where I'm not looking super awesome, and then end it with a nice strong picture. So those are some very interesting expectations to manage as we move through those sorts of things. So we're almost out of time, so I want to take a moment here to thank you for participating. I know that you're in the middle of dissertation land, and that every moment counts, so I'm very grateful for you taking the opportunity to join us and to help break down these really important issues that people often act on, but don't really consciously think about. So thank you for that time.
Yeah, no, thank you. I enjoyed the chance to talk about it. And like you said, I think it's really important to talk about things that seem counterintuitive at first, and then we can actually try to dive into it.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gents, we have about 2 episodes left, and they're going to be non-traditional episodes. We're going to be talking about some very sensitive topics next week when we discuss the role that communication plays and the role that close relationships play in recovering from things like addiction. The week after that, we're going to be fortunate enough to talk with the newly elected Vice President of Student Affairs to break down the importance of like peer-to-peer relationships, especially in the age of COVID. That's something that's been extremely important. But those are future topics, and then we'll be done with the season, and we'll have a couple of summer specials, and then hopefully we'll get right back into things in the fall. But that is, in fact, all the time that we have for today. I thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all in the very near future about recovery.
You've been listening to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you'd like to be on the show or have questions for us, please send us an email to redrockrelationships@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Red Rock Relationships. Thank you again. And remember, it all begins with good communication. This has been a production from A Podcast Studio.